Welcome back, everybody. It's been a treat to hear Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta on a weekly basis, and so it's again falls on me. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta to the Global Humanities lecture, the third one today, entitled Modern Politics and the Sovereignty of God. As there are a number of new people here today, I think I would just quickly say that Global Humanities was started in 2020 by Chris Young, who was then the head of the School of Arts and Humanities, and Hans van der Ven, and Ezra Ozarek, and I came onto it a few months later. And Pratap was one of the first people we spoke to, and as many of you would know, this is a flagship university initiative with really robust partnerships with 7 universities, including Ashoka University, where Pratap was Vice-Chancellor. We're thankful to Trinity College for their hospitality and sponsorship, particularly Charles Fonseca, who has really enabled this partnership with Global Humanities. I would be remiss if I were not to say that Pratap is easily the most influential public intellectual of India, but also of the globe increasingly. His writings, as I said before, order the very disordered nature and very noisy nature of Indian politics, and he has been doing that now for 2 decades. What is less appreciated, though it marks as a signifier in the CV, is that Pratap has been a serious institution builder in India, a place which is not very hard, easy to do so. First with the Center for Policy Research, which is India's sort of flagship policy think tank, thanks mainly to do with his leadership, and then as Vice-Chancellor of Ashoka University, India's leading liberal arts university in the private sector. Pratap has written on a large number of things, the Indian Constitution, Indian democracy, geopolitics, political thought, and today's series of lectures follows from the first 2 lectures first on the global sort of imagination of political thought, the second one on Indian political thought, and today, I think, on religion, and before the final one, which I'm very eagerly waiting for, on the party state in contemporary Indian politics. So please join me in welcoming Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta.
There's so many people to thank, but I'll save it for the last lecture. Thank you all for coming. It's been really a kind of endurance test for many of you, and all credit to you for putting up with these lectures. So in the last lecture, and this one kind of today's builds on the last one, we looked at the trajectory of Indian political thought within the kind of framework of this sort of tour de horizon of global political thought in the 20th century. And we looked at the way at which it operates within the dimension within a particular form of liberal constitutionalism. And in particular, I looked at 4 sites at which there was a kind of attempt to transcend liberal constitutionalism. One was, as it were, from within the language of liberal constitutionalism, and in particular, the debates over representation. The 2 other attempts were from the standpoint of organic social relations or community, or from a standpoint from outside of politics, which is some kind of ethical or perfectionism. And I argue that these standpoints try to radically reconfigure Hindu thought in the 20th century to connect it to new forms of political agency. I charted the failure of these projects, and I argued that not only were these projects failures, they were actually recognized to be failures by those who advocated them. And the result was that in the embers of those failures, all that was left of Indian political thought was this oscillation between a very defensive liberal constitutionalism, where we are just kind of hanging on to this framework of liberal constitutionalism precariously hanging on to it on the one hand, as it is being challenged by a new form of politics, agential politics, which believes in a pure theodicy of power and conflict, namely Hindu nationalism. Today, what I'll do, in a sense, kind of building on that, is kind of moving that toward the horizon, is this was kind of meant to be, or is going to be, a lecture on Islamic political thought, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But it actually builds on the lecture on Indian political thought, because in a sense, the two Islamic thinkers I'm going to talk about most are Iqbal and Maududi. They are arguably, and I'd certainly make the claim for Maududi, probably one of the most influential political thinkers of the 20th century, just in the range of countries in which he's actually foundational. What's remarkable about them, they come out of the Indian milieu, and much is made of that fact. But they are actually the two political thinkers that go global the most. And interestingly, they go global in ways that actually transcends often the normal sectarian divides within Islam, Shia, Sunni, and so forth. I mean, the remarkable translation histories influence in Pakistan, Iran, Egypt, actually even Nigeria in some senses. I mean, they are kind of the two biggest kind of political theory experts. And I'll use them in a sense to actually frame the problem of modern politics and the sovereignty of God. So before I get to them, three preliminary remarks are in order. One on my use of the term Islamic, which today I'll just use as a placeholder. It's not a theorized term. I'm not going to define what Islamic means. I hope it will become clear as I'm talking. I'm not even competent to, or don't want even to get into a debate over what is Islamic. Suffice it to say that for the purposes of my talk, this is a form of political imaginary drawn from thinkers who thought of themselves as Islamic and drew upon the resources of that tradition. As Alistair MacIntyre always insisted, canons of rational justification are embedded in history. What questions are considered important, what aims are to be achieved in the process of inquiry, and more importantly, what counts as a successful resolution of inquiry are often tradition dependent, and these thinkers, in a sense, identified with an Islamic tradition in some senses, right? So they situate themselves in that tradition. The second preliminary remark, this is a kind of parenthetical aside, is that one of the curiosities about modern South Asian political thinking, it has to be said, I think, regrettably, that Islamic or Hindu political thought are for the most part two streams that run in parallel. There are great accommodations between these two religious traditions at a vernacular level, at a social level or a literary level, and some would argue perhaps even at a civilizational level, where the admixture of these traditions is immense and great. There were also many prominent pre-modern projects. Think of Dara Shikoh's great text, Majma'ul Bahrain, the meeting of the two oceans, where there was this kind of metaphysical fantasy that the encounter of these two traditions would not just be a synthesis, but would actually produce something startlingly new at the point at which these two oceans and these two horizons meet in some senses, right? But it is remarkable how rare these kinds of projects are. And by the late 19th century, what is remarkable, at least at the level of systematic philosophical thinking, is that these are, as I said, at best two banks of a river running in parallel, and even the river kind of dries up soon enough, and the banks never meet. While the two communities, Hindus and Muslims, broadly speaking, are socially, politically intimate, almost obsessed with each other, violent fraternity, perilous intimacies, just to refer to kind of two ways in which this relationship has been recently described. In practices of thought, these communities were actually profoundly partitioned. They do not figure in each other's utopias, where there is a taciturn reluctance even to be seen to be exercising minimal interpretive authority over the other's tradition. Both of these traditions dialectically reconfigure themselves in relation to European thought, right, and engage with it deeply. But the remarkable fact is none of them actually wanted to provincialize Europe. What they actually provincialized was each other. I mean, it's almost like Iqbal and Aurobindo are sort of inhabiting the same time, talking about the same philosophical questions, almost no engagement with each other, right? And I think this is something that I think bears actually some political reflection and philosophical reflection. The third preliminary remark is that, like in my previous lectures, my focus is, although I'm going to speak about Iqbal and Maududi, the focus is going to be less on these two individual thinkers, but an emphasis on the constellation of elements that go into the making of their political imaginary. I should acknowledge fully that the actual shape of political thought, and certainly politics, is shaped by lots of complicated material and political realities. The different experience of colonization, authoritarianism, sectarianism, political economy, all kinds of tactical compromises. So my account is not an account of the actual complexities of politics. It is rather about how the question of the rejuvenation of the Islamic tradition, particularly in South Asia, and the awakening of the Muslim world, and giving it a new power and political form, was actually framed in theoretical terms. What possibilities does this constellation of elements open up? And what possibilities does this constellation of elements constrain? In other words, I'm going to be talking in a sense about the territory over which this political thought operates, or to use McIntyrean language, what their own conception of what a successful project of rejuvenation would have to do. What is, in a sense, the criteria, the benchmark of philosophical success here, in some ways. Right? Now, I argue, and I won't go into that in great detail, that actually this form of political thinking consisted of, in a sense, 10 distinctive strands. And in a sense, if you had to be a successful Muslim political theorist, you had to, in a sense, come up with a philosophical framework that answered to these 10 different strands. Now, mercifully, I'll spare you and won't go through these 10 different strands. I'll focus on actually 2 that are critical to my argument. I'll just mention the others in passing. The most important one, which is where I kind of want to begin with, is in a sense, a axiological one, and an axiology that translates into a phenomenology as well, is the claim that whatever form of political or social existence we have, it must preserve what we call the unity of experience, and its axiological correlate, the unity of value. This is a deeply metaphysical idea that comes in different forms. Our sense of self, on this view, is not isolated but interconnected and forms a unified whole. None of these Parfitian and Lockean anxieties about kind of empirical serial selves. Absolutely none, actually. In Iqbal's formulation, in a sense, the locus of that self is, of course, khudi. The different aspects of our being are combined and held together in consciousness, creating a unified sense of the world and of our place in it that is, in a sense, continuous with that world. Where exactly the self is experienced? Is it experienced in mystical states, in piety, in the experience of manifestations of God, is up for debate. But what is not up for debate, if one were to put it in negative terms, is what this conception of the unity of experience opposes. It is a frontal critique of the fragmentation of value that all these thinkers take to be the hallmark of modernity. So think of a Weberian picture of the social world, where various value spheres, the political, the economic, the aesthetic, the erotic, the transcendental, each operate with their own distinctive logic, impinging on us in contradictory ways. The aesthetic, the erotic, and the transcendental are radically subjectivized under conditions of modernity, and the experience of self itself is profoundly fragmented. Now, there are various critiques of this form of fragmentation that modernity produces in the West itself. In some senses, Marxism is also as much a revolt against the contradictions of social reality as much as it is a revolt against the facts of exploitation, right? And for this reason, in a sense, parts of Marxism prove extremely congenial to this tradition. Is there a form of social existence that can restore unity of self and value, and where the organic wholeness of life is not shattered into painful oppositions? Any successful resolution of the problem of the rejuvenation of Islam, in some senses, will have to solve this problem. And so the claim that this unity of self has a rational basis emerges out of appropriate kind of different forms of knowledge. And I think one of the fascinating projects to be done in a kind of 20th century history of global political thought is how much this problematic of the fragmentation of value actually recurs in different contexts and different responses to it. And it's of course not an accident that the European thinkers that are deeply important for people like Iqbal and even Maududi are actually people like Bergson and so forth, in a sense, who are actually frontally challenging the idea of fragmentation of value. Right? Now, the political diagnosis, and I'll be interested mostly in the politics of it, which I'll come to in a second. But the political diagnosis that goes with this critique of the fragmentation of value is quite striking, which is that the state must in some way be an instrument for achieving this unity of experience and this form of perfection. There's a clear political diagnosis and a critique of, particularly a critique of Christianity at two levels in both of these thinkers. The first is that the separation of church and state is actually a reinsertion of the bifurcation of experience, right? In a sense, it's the first instance of the fragmentation of value that you can think of. But the deeper critique, which is actually very striking, particularly in Iqbal, is to actually see the history of Christianity as a story of immense tragedy. And the immense tragedy is the following. I mean, to put it crudely, this is Iqbal's kind of line of thought, which is that Christians thought that they, by separating church and state, they could actually preserve the church. And this is a kind of article of faith in 19th century liberal political theory in some senses, the Tocquevillian idea that the more you separate the church and state, the more it, in a sense, liberates religion as an autonomous realm to be kind of experienced on its own terms, particularly in private and civil society. Both of these thinkers are very adamant that the one lesson the history of Christianity tells us is there is no halfway house between the secularization of the political state and complete and total secularization altogether in some ways. It's actually quite remarkable that it's in the beginning of the 20th century that they've already pronounced Christianity as being vanquished by modernity almost completely. I mean, it's actually quite remarkable how much the story of Christianity is told as a story of political tragedy. That here are these Christians thinking they can hold on to, right? Something like a kind of, Christian faith in the modern world. It's not going to happen under conditions of the separation of church and state, right? And it's striking, just to quote one sentence from Maududi, when he talks about axiology, and this is actually a remarkable sentence that makes you sit up. He says, the fragmentation, the division of life into compartments is itself the ultimate form of jahaliyat. Jahaliyat refers to that condition before the rise of Islam in some senses, before the rise of enlightenment, in the sense when the world is kind of mired in ignorance of some kind. And Maududi makes this absolutely radically striking claim that the division of life into compartments is itself the most profound manifestation of a state of jahaliyat you can be in. And I'll come to, again, the political implications of this in a second. The second, so any kind of theory of rejuvenation has to kind of involve this project in some senses of not just defeating value pluralism, right, but actually thinking of the social forms that can make this unity of experience possible. So they learn from the mistakes of Christianity. That's the big refrain. The second major point is the kind of critique of Hellenism. And the critique of Hellenism, again, interestingly, is in part directly taken from Nietzsche. Nietzsche's antagonism with Socrates and Platonic metaphysics is reasonably well known. Nietzsche, as you know, in Ecce Homo declared, "My readers know perhaps in what way I consider dialectics as a symptom of decadence." To summarize Nietzsche's antagonism, Socrates dissolved what Nietzsche considered to be the highest achievement of Greek philosophy, which is a living agon between different ways of life. In the guise of the agon, or a philosophical contrast, we are now led to so-called higher truths, the metaphysical form of the good. For Nietzsche, Socrates, and particularly Plato, are not philosophical heroes. They are often presented to be in textbooks, right? But they are actually the end of genuine Greek philosophy and the bridge towards Christian metaphysics, right? One of the things that unites Maududi and Iqbal and almost every kind of modernist Islamic thinker, at least in South Asia, if not elsewhere, is this idea that it was the contamination of Islam by Greek rationalism, Greek metaphysics, and Greek Neoplatonism. This is a kind of package, right? That actually bifurcates the world of experience in some senses. I mean, think of, in a sense, Plato's conception of transcendence, in a sense, as sundering the unity of experience by thinking of transcendence as something that lies outside of the experience of our historical particulars. It was this Greek thrust, this Hellenic thrust of rationalism, that moved Islam away from concreteness, action, knowledge, and unity. The claim that Hellenistic rationalism is both a turning away from the particular of experience in all its concreteness, right? And the project of modern Islam has to be to replace the spirit of Hellenism with what they call the concrete spirit of the Quran, which is antithetical to the speculative impulses of Greek philosophy. So in this view, in some senses, it is actually the Quran that engages with the concrete particulars of our existence. It's Greek metaphysics that in some senses abstracts away from them, right? In Iqbal's hands, this concrete spirit, as he calls it, of the Quran, might in the first instance open up the connection between science and Islam, nature and religion, right? Because if the point is to actually, in a sense, overcome these dualisms, then you actually have to take science on board, although there are limits to how much you might take it on board. I'll come to it in a second. Both of them are very clear that rationalism has its limits. Like Kant, any rationalism would end up revealing its own limits. And so the path out of rationalism, one path out of rationalism was pure empiricism. But the problem with pure empiricism, that it neither secures the unity of the self nor knowledge of God. And therefore the sense of self and the unity of being is something that would have to be accessed through other forms of knowledge. In Iqbal's case, a certain form of intuitionism. So just park these two sort of abstract metaphysical thoughts for a second, and I'll come to kind of their political implications in a second. Now, as I mentioned, there are 8 other kind of constellations in this thing, in this social imaginary. I'll just mention them briefly. So any modern Islamic project of rejuvenation, if it has to be successful, has to overcome the legacy of Hellenism, overcome the fragmentation of value. It has to benchmark Muslim identity. And the question of benchmarking is an important one. The question is not what is the essence of being Muslim. But one of the things that it has to do is, in a sense, resist the temptation that being Muslim will be simply a matter of self-identification as a Muslim, right? And again, as we know in South Asia and elsewhere, the politics of benchmarking actually becomes hugely significant, Again, I'm just mentioning this, parking them before I come to the main argument. Benchmarking Muslim identity. It would have to delineate an account of the relationship between religious knowledge and other forms of knowledge, including science. It would have to find a way of establishing a place for Sharia. The authority and scope for Sharia is up for contestation. But what is not up for contestation is that Sharia is, in its basic form, a substantive vision for emancipation of mankind. It would have to wrestle with the question of what political form best gives expression to all of these values that we just talked about. Is it the nation state? Is it a confederation of states? Is it a transnational community? It would have to provide a diagnostic of what the threat to this rejuvenation is. And that's why the category of Jahiliyyah becomes so important in modern Islamic political thought. It would have to provide a mode of political action, right? Different forms of interpretation of jihad, shahadat. And in the final analysis also suggests forms of political organization that could carry out this project. So you can see, I mean, this is an extraordinary standard for any successful political theory to meet, right? But that's how the problematic, in a sense, is being set up. That's the standard of rational justification to which this political tradition is being held. Now, why did I begin with this abstract metaphysical claim about critique of value pluralism? And what was its kind of political implication? The reason I began with that claim is it's become pretty commonplace in historiography of political thought in South Asia, and particularly the debate over democracy and Muslim political thought in South Asia. It's become pretty commonplace to argue that a figure like Maududi, who coined the term theodemocracy, which I'll talk about in a second, was actually a creation of the experience of majoritarianism in pre-colonial India. Right? Maududi very famously argued that all democracies were majoritarian, not just in the trivial sense that in every democracy, if you were to define it as such, ultimately the majority rules, but in a deeper sense that that majority was always be identified with a particular community. And Maududi's striking historical claim was all majorities were majoritarian in this way. His critique of England was that actually England was not, as it were, a democracy. It was actually a form of majoritarian Anglican rule to suppress the Irish and the Scots. Right? So he says there's just no instance of a democracy that's majoritarian as we understand it in democratic theory, just a counting of sort of 51% of the votes, right? But Maududi's argument is not empirical, as it were. It's not founded just on a kind of contingent historical suspicion that majority rule in an undivided India would simply mean rule by Hindus because they were numerically in greater numbers. It was in some ways a more profound conceptual argument, actually almost an a priori argument, that no facts about the actual conduct of Hindu-Muslim politics could alter. For one thing, his argument rested on the conceptual impossibility of us relating to the states as mere citizens, abstracting away from the religious identities we have. And in part, we can't do that because that just is the instance of a kind of fragmentation of value. The idea that community identity or religious identity will not and ought not have to have any bearing on our rights as citizens. The idea that the modern state would, at least for political purposes, requires rights to be detached from identity was actually considered an impossibility. So this kind of Madisonian conception that the majorities that democracy produce would in a sense be these contingent floating majorities, right, is just ruled out as a kind of conceptual impossibility. The fear here is not majoritarianism, right, although it's articulated as such. The fear here is that the veil of anonymity that liberalism throws over identity is a facade, and that one of the paradoxes of Indian secularism is that the consistently liberal position, right, that your religious identity must not determine what rights you have as citizens, was actually consistently conflated with the majoritarian position. Right? Partly because they do not think that such a thing could even be possible. But more importantly for Maududi, even if our religious identities as citizens could be detached, the bifurcation of citizenship and religion produces exactly that fragmentation of value and experience that is the sign of ethical and political failure. The only condition under which political society could create a unity of experience and prevent the fragmentation of value is if political power was in the hands of co-religionists, united by the same aim of the common good of that tradition. To just give one very striking illustrations of this, one of the puzzles about Iqbal's argument, who also I think believes something like this, is that Iqbal actually thought of Ataturk's Turkey as an Islamic state, which upsets our kind of usual categorization of the opposition between Turkish secularism and Islam, right? But what Iqbal simply means by that is that wherever there is a state where sovereign power is in hands of Muslims collectively exercising that power, collectively exercising that deliberation towards a common shared good, the shared identity of the deliberators was necessary for securing that unity of experience, right? Again, this is an argument that rests on that view that the Madisonian claim about democracy as a series of contingent majorities was simply an impossibility. Which is why I find this claim in South Asian historiography that kind of Maududi's political thought and Iqbal's political thought was determined by the contingent experience of majoritarian rule in some senses. Actually quite misleading. I think it's almost over-determined by the conceptual categories in sense they used. There are, of course, famously other strands to Maududi's critique of democracy. There is the argument from incapacity. Our judgments are prone to partiality, error, and passion. But this fallibility of human beings, which in other Islamic thinkers like Abdul Kalim Surush becomes an argument for democracy, and traditionally has been one of the arguments for liberal open societies, is actually turned on its head. The argument from fallibility is used to make the claim, as Andrew March has pointed out, that the conclusion to be drawn from that is that we are not actually capable of legislating at all. And of course, Maududi's famous example is actually Americans discussing prohibition. They kind of change their mind back and forth without any change in the rational structure of the argument, in some senses underlying it. The second argument is that popular sovereignty, as Democrats promise us, is an illusion anyway. This is very much part of an early 20th century critique of parliamentarianism. Parliamentarianism sets up representatives as a class apart with interests of their own, right? But Maududi's most striking claim was that any submission to popular sovereignty is itself a species of domination, and he uses the word domination. This is so in two ways. The first, any submission to any form of human authority other than God's authority is actually an instance of domination, even if it is subordination to a collectivity. The claim that popular sovereignty or acceding to popular sovereignty is not a species of domination, because in subjecting ourselves to it, we are subjecting ourselves to the very conditions that reconciles our political equality with social cooperation. Maududi says this is just an outright lie. To subject oneself to the will of another collectivity, right, is just the meaning of domination. Popular sovereignty is not, in this view, contra Rousseau, my own will coming back to me in my alienated majesty. It just is an alien will. It just is not my will. For Maududi, therefore, the question of domination cannot be settled independently of the substantive moral laws that govern us. And here he uses this kind of interesting analogy using the dispute between Grotius and Rousseau, actually, where he says, look, people used to identify, in a sense, consent with freedom. But of course, very famously, you can consent yourself into slavery, right? Acceding to popular sovereignty is like that. That you cannot say that acceding to popular sovereignty secures the condition of your freedom unless you have a substantive account of what it is that popular sovereignty actually chooses to do, right? So, popular sovereignty, in a sense, democracy as we understand it, just is a instance of domination, right? So, popular sovereignty will not work, as it were, unless, in a sense, it's backed up with a full account of the substantive material, moral, ethical, and religious conditions that actually secure justice in the ethical life. And it's in this context that Maududi thinks of Sharia as that utopia that, in some senses, promises emancipation. The state has to encourage and enforce all those good practices that Islam desires that humanity to adopt, and to discourage, eradicate, and sometimes even crush with full force all those evils from which Islam aims to purge mankind. So this is a political imagination that in some senses very strongly militates against proceduralism of any kind. I mean, Maududi even extends that critiques to the adversarial legal system in some ways, right? That, again, the question at the end of the day is, do you get substantive justice? Not, in a sense, this confidence that that procedure will somehow create the conditions of, producing perfect justice. And therefore, if we are to think of human emancipation, we have to think of a substantive series of precepts that unleash our potential for the fullest moral life. And of course, for Maududi, this ultimately is Sharia. God's right to command and legislate not only stems from his power, as in a kind of standard Hobbesian story, but it also stems from the justice God secures for human beings through Sharia, which for Maududi is an immutable code of behavior. Divine and popular sovereignty are antagonistic, since divine sovereignty alone, as it operates through Sharia, secures the true conditions of our moral freedom. Right? Now, it is not quite right to argue, as Andrew March argues, that in Maududi's conception, God functions, to borrow Richard's phrase, as a kind of sleeping sovereign. That once God has made revelation, he goes off to sleep. The revelation is sealed and final in some senses. Right? In some sense, that is true. There is not going to be any new revelation. But in other sense, God's revelation actually continues to speak to us through the written word. God's sovereignty must be interpreted, and this requires expertise. Every system of law, Maududi argues, requires guardianship. I'll not go into the details of what guardianship means for it. Maududi is a little bit ambiguous about the right of individual judgment in the face of the pronouncements of this kind of expert sort of pronouncement on what the sovereignty of God requires. But what he is very clear is that if there is going to be any legitimate rebellion against the pronouncements of these experts, it has to be in the name of a better understanding of God's word. But as we all know, this sharp antagonism that he draws between popular sovereignty and divine sovereignty is very slightly, only very slightly, I think the degree of this attenuation has been exaggerated in secondary literature. Maududi is not near being a Democrat or a liberal. It is attenuated in two ways. The first is that while God has legislative power, no delegated form of executive authority that is going to enforce that legislation can be legitimate unless it stems from authorization of the people. And no interpretation of law can be valid if it has not involved at least some consultation with the people as a whole, and a consultation that is held in conditions that are free and open, right? As Andrew March has rightly pointed out, even if God is legislature, there remains considerable role for the constituent power of the people, including delineating a form of actual executive power, filling in the Sharia silences. But one of the remarkable things Maududi says is that whatever this executive power is, it can't have any emergency powers to override God's law. Divine sovereignty needs the viceregency of man to be executed, right? And it is to be hoped that by receiving authorization from the people, that acts as a kind of check on the tendencies of this delegated executive power towards corruption. Now, the idea of divine sovereignty in Maududi's very complex, Qasim Zaman's absolutely brilliant work, it's not going to be surpassed in, I think, modern intellectual history, I think gives you a full account of it. But what you can clearly see even in this brief sketch is Maududi leaves you with, in a sense, a four-part structure for the constitutional order, whose elements are: there's divine sovereignty, with expert guardianship over the law, with the authority to rule underwritten by popular sovereignty, and an understanding of Sharia as providing the substantive precepts of emancipation. Now, you could question the validity of each of these elements. Is Sharia really in some senses, a charter of emancipation? But the most striking thing about Maududi's legacy is that this constellation of four elements, in the way he interprets it, becomes a kind of template for thinking about modern Islamic constitutionalism as in contexts as diverse as kind of Iran and Egypt. They're kind of plays of how to, in a sense, balance these four elements in different forms, and as in a sense would be obvious, they all end up, in a sense, with their own inner contradictions. Right? But I, in a sense, want to return to the point I kind of began with before this excursion to Maududi's critique of democracy, which is the point about Jahiliyyah. And as I said, the most striking thing about Maududi's conception of Jahiliyyah, which is what is the biggest threat to the Islamic constitutional order as he envisages it, right? Is, as he says very categorically, the division of life into compartments. Any social form and ideology where you see that division becomes, in a sense, an existential threat to this project. And this is basically the idea that Qutb then, in a sense, kind of radicalizes, right? It's an idea that becomes very important from everybody from Qutb to Khomeini. And therefore, I think it's a mistake to think that Maududi's political philosophy is actually just coming from the South Asian experience of the minoritization of Muslims as a minority, right? It actually has, in a sense, deep roots in this conception of rational, just ethical justification that he has actually set himself, right? If you actually think that the standard of rational justification as a successful society is restoring the unity of value, of course, by definition, any society that in some senses does not accept that, right, becomes a kind of existential threat. Right? Now, very quickly, in some sense, switching to Bal. Now, so this is one kind of constitutional schema that comes out of, and as I said, it has deep roots in a axiological claim. There is another imagination of this relationship that comes out of South Asia in the shape of Muhammad Iqbal, and that, of course, also travels very widely. And I've written on Iqbal elsewhere at great length, one of the most astonishing intellectuals South Asia has produced. But it is interesting to begin with, because Iqbal and Maududi are often thought of as kind of opposites. The ground Iqbal shares with Maududi, and again, it's the ground of the unity of experience and a revolt against the fragmentation of value. It also contains, as I've argued, a critique of rationalism and Hellenism, right? And what Iqbal shares with Maududi is the claim that the problem of the fragmentation of value cannot be solved unless a group of believers is united by a common aim, collectively exercising sovereignty over their own affairs. The problem of liberal citizenship is once again its compartmentalization. What has kind of compelled circumstances where modern man has ceased to live soulfully. Like with Maududi, Iqbal's target is not just liberal modernity with its kind of bifurcation. It is also, in a sense, traditional forms of mysticism. Because as we saw in the last lecture, traditional forms of mysticism, by positing a realm of being and transcendence that lies outside of the material realities of existence, again, in a sense, bifurcates our existence and creates a kind of dualism. So it's both the liberal West and, as he calls it, the mystical and Muslim East, right, that have both created havoc in thinking about what living soulfully means. Now, interpreting Iqbal politically is always tricky, as those of you who've read him know. Iqbal once described Nietzsche as someone whose heart is of a believer, even though he's an infidel. And it might equally be said appropriately of Iqbal that his heart had something of the infidel in him, even though he professed to be a believer. Epistemologically, as I argued, his project was to rescue Islam from both Hellenism and a world abnegating mysticism, hence his critique of a certain form of Sufism, right? And he uses Bergson to great effect in this respect. Ontologically, Iqbal is obsessed with the problem of individuation. The difference of the universe, divine universe, into individual selves for Iqbal cannot be regarded as mere illusion, right? Since we are at Cambridge, it's worth mentioning Iqbal's correspondence with Cambridge idealist Mac Taggart, with whom he worked a lot. In correspondence he writes, the absolute further differentiates itself into concrete egos. The universe is not an illusion. It is a system of real selves which cannot be regarded as mere predicates or adjectives of the absolute. And Mac Taggart, on reading Iqbal, writes to him, I agree with you, as you know, in regarding quite untenable the view that finite beings are adjectives of the absolute. Whatever they are, it is quite certain to me they are not that. Right? So in some senses, at least in terms of kind of thinking of divine intelligence, Iqbal is one of the great theorists in some senses of individuality. Ethically, Iqbal wants a new and attractive conception of freedom. He is a generation of thinkers for whom freedom does not end with the question of what are the external constraints on our action. It is a question of how the self strives to be free through forms of becoming, in almost again a Nietzschean sense. And how do we name the quality of the self that continually strives and remains distinct and yet related to divine purposes? The anthropologist Naveda Khan has drawn out the political significance of Iqbal's conception of self-creation, or in a sense his interpretation of Swaraj, if we might call it that. The self as involved in the task of constitutionally and continually amending itself, of working on one's own constitution to effect not just a change in oneself, but a change in the body politic. The individual on this view becomes a locus of a mysterious self-generating force. Right? And for Iqbal, the theological sanction for this thinking of the individual as a self-generating force comes from three conditions. First, the finality of the prophet. It is important that Muslims declared the finality of the prophet because the expectation that there might be another prophet is an expectation that we are going to be under the perpetual tutelage of someone else. The prophet for Iqbal is the exemplar of a creator, the mystic who becomes a prophet, an agent who inserts himself into the sweep of history. And this for him becomes the uncompromising benchmark of being Muslim. The finality of the prophet, the embracing of the taboo about criticizing prophet in some senses as a new condition of emancipation. And of course, as we know, this has politically tragic consequences, particularly when we think of the debate over whether Muslims can, in a sense, self-define themselves in relation, let's say, the Ahmadiyya question in Pakistan. But most importantly, Iqbal argues that Islam should not be given basis in a system of law, as Maududi had suggested, but as an existential basis in pure self-creation. Revelation is an incandescent force that operates through human action, rather than the unquestioning acceptance of divine instruction congealed in law. And Iqbal's search for this kind of agency is actually in some senses extreme. As he puts it, the final act is not an intellectual act, but a vital act that deepens the whole being of ego and sharpen its will with creative assurance that the world is not something to be known through concepts, but to be continually made and remade through continuous action, something Mao would have actually agreed with. It was, as it were, a permanent rebellion and a kind of sensibility that he shares, for example, with people like Shariati and so forth. Right? And what's striking about Iqbal is so obsessed is he and so kind of mesmerized by this kind of fascination with self-creation, is that for him, any form of political action that exhibits creativity, right, is actually praiseworthy. So Wahhabism and Ataturk are in a sense both praiseworthy because they are actually both instances of a form of self-creation. I mean, in a sense, he kind of refuses to be bound in some senses by any kind of, legal or moral framework. And action is objective in its own right? And as you can see, one of the challenges of this view is that it has a certain kind of nihilism built into it. As Asghar Ali Engineer, one of the most acute readers of Iqbal, once asked, if every agent is allowed, in a sense, to pursue fresh ends, what becomes of divine ends in guiding destiny, right? And again, just a last example of Iqbal's sensibility, that famous couplet, an infidel sitting before an idol active is better than a Muslim asleep in the shrine. Right? Now, you can see in some ways, I think, and that's about, which is that this tradition bequeaths these, in a sense, kind of two contrasting traditions, right? Of reclaiming the project of rejuvenation and restoring, in some senses, political agency to Muslims. But both end up with, again, this kind of radical internal aporia. In Maududi's case, in some senses, apart from the kind of, in a sense, this very questionable claim of, is his interpretation of Sharia, can it ever be imagined as a charter of emancipation? But just even in its formal structure, the different elements of divine sovereignty, popular sovereignty, his conception of freedom and guardianship over God's laws provides an absolutely astonishingly unstable mix of what a stable order of political order would look like. And Iqbal's, in a sense, reclaiming, which at one level is hugely exciting, kind of opening up this promise of extraordinary liberation from tutelage, right? In fact, including tutelage from, in a sense, one's own limitations in self, constantly overcoming it, right? Actually ends up in a form of political nihilism, very paradoxically, right? And one could argue in some senses, like we saw in the case of Indian political thought last time, is that much of the politics of the world that was influenced by these two figures, in some senses, is still operating between, kind of oscillating between these two unstable paradigms of an extraordinarily restrictive but unstable legalism on the one hand, right? And an extraordinarily kind of nihilist call to revolutionary action on the other. But, as I said, the source of the problem, I think, initially lies in that whole-scale rejection of value pluralism and fragmentation, whereby any condition of modernity, by definition, becomes a condition of jahiliya, a condition to be overcome. Thank you.